This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Welcome back to another episode of Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast made through Manawatu People's Radio with the support of New Zealand On Air, and we look at great trash and difficult art. And difficult, I guess, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting with this particular episode, because what I wanted to talk about is not really difficult in the sense that the music's like hard to listen to or unpleasant. It's more that there's a certain amount of kind of implied difficulty, because there's a lot of stuff here that I really like and my guest really likes that didn't ever really find kind of broad mainstream success, which suggests that there's some sort of barrier there, and maybe we can speculate about what it is. But I've talked for too long without introducing a person. Here's the guest for this evening. This is Nancy Howie, member of band Tweed, also aka Fathom, when you're doing strange musical instrument things. Good evening. How's it going?
It's going well, Hugh. Thank you for having me.
Well, I mean, thanks for coming on, based largely on the fact that we had this kind of spur of the moment side discussion when I did an interview with you about the Fathom album, and we kind of got into this thing about the Joe Boyd, John Wood extended universe of
That's right.
It's particularly like 60s and 70s British music, but it kind of expands out from that. So you got super into it and had like visual aids that you were showing me before I hit record. Do you maybe want to start by like leading into your connection with this music?
Sure. Well, with reference to your mention of the visual aid, I made a couple of playlists just to refamiliarize myself with everything in anticipation of this discussion. And I started by making a Joe Boyd playlist, and then that expanded into making a John Wood playlist. And then I realized that they're essentially the same playlist. So there's a lot of working together and back and forth between these two. My introduction to this world would have been through John Martyn, who I started listening to about 7 years ago. I picked up his album for about Solidaire for about $2 at Real Groovy on vinyl, because I'd had a quick listen to it and thought it sounded magnificent. And 7 years later, I still think it sounds magnificent. To be fair, I think he self-produced that one, but he had worked a lot with Joe Boyd and John Wood. So he was sort of the doorway through to Fairport Convention, Fotheringay, incredible string band to an extent, Richard Thompson, Bert Jansch, John Renbourn, just that whole family. So...
Yeah. So I think if people are wondering what on earth we're talking about from a standing start, I suppose I should clarify. Joe Boyd is an American who moved to the UK in the early 60s and became a record producer. And he had a long-standing working relationship with this guy, John Wood, who is mostly a sound engineer, but also sometimes works as a producer, and ran the studio called Sound Techniques that Joe Boyd favored for a lot of stuff. And so what we're discussing is kind of the constellation of acts that come out of that. And as you say, John Martyn's a great window in, because he has he's very approachable but also very unique, and sort of as you get deeper in or further out, depending on how you look at it, some of the stuff that Joe Boyd was into and produced is less approachable and odder in a lot of ways.
It can be. He sort of runs the gamut from really traditional British folk through to, he did some interesting stuff with American funk and even world artists. But yeah, I think probably my favorites that they worked with were Nick Drake and Martyn. I find that they tap into a lot of things that I really love when I'm listening to music. In particular, the harmonic foundation of the music that they write is complex and really interesting to me. And both of them were innately musical and very, very good musicians in their own right.
And of course, you mentioned Solid Air as your kind of initial window into this, and the song Solid Air is a song that John Martyn wrote kind of for and about Nick Drake.
That's right.
Because the other kind of recurring feature, the reason that I kind of jokingly called it the Joe Boyd John Wood extended universe is that there was a while where Joe Boyd was running a label called Witch Season, and
that's right. Yeah.
All of the people on Witch Season tend to show up on each other's stuff. They were all, to some degree or another, at least acquaintances, if not friends. They tend to play on each other's things, and so you end up with this. I don't know. It's almost, for that period, almost kind of a Joe Boyd, John Wood sound, just based on the fact that you keep getting the same people show up. You keep hearing Danny Thompson show up playing bass.
Yeah, I was going to say Danny Thompson is a big one. I actually ended up making a list because he was on so many different recordings. So he had the band the Pentangle. He played on 5,000 Spirits, which was an album by the Incredible String Band. He played with Richard Thompson, John Martyn, Alan Holdsworth, Bert Jansch, Donovan, Michael Chapman, Ralph McTell, Mary Hopkin. Like, he's just played with everyone. And I just love his sound too, because he brings this really sort of sultry double bass style. It really defines the sound. So as you say, there is a similarity between all of these acts by virtue of the fact that it's a lot of the same musicians.
Yeah, if people want just a stunning kind of show-off thing for Danny Thompson's bass sound, there's an album that he did with Richard Thompson called Industry, which is like I think it's credited as Richard Thompson and Danny Thompson, and it's a sort of concept-ish album looking at industrialization and the impact of that in the UK. I think it's a sort of response to Thatcherism, sort of a deal. But anyway, there's an instrumental on that called. It's got this really long title, which is a dialogue between two people. It's like, Kitty, I hear the sound of boots coming down the street. Kitty is the person who's talking, and then it's like, Pete, well, put mine out and see if they follow, or something like that. It's got this really weird title. Find the album Industry and you'll find the one with the stupidly long title. And a lot of that...
I'm going to look that up. That definitely sounds like my kind of thing.
A lot of that particular song is led by like a long bass solo by Danny Thompson. So you just kind of get to hear him show off all over the place. And he is a marvel to behold. He's really cool.
As a bassist, I have all the time in the world for that.
Yeah. Let the bassist have a shot. Go on.
That's right. Give them a moment.
So, having started with John Martyn and found your way to Nick Drake, and then the rest of it, like, is there something that seems to you like it's kind of, I don't know, the common core or a common approach that is kind of like musically attractive about this stuff?
That's a really interesting question. I lived on the west coast of the States for a few years in my early teens, and perhaps because I was there, the sort of west coast folk rock sound really seeped into my musical DNA. So I really love that Laurel Canyon folk, so like Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Jackson Browne, Carole King, that whole family of musicians, which I suppose in a way is like the American counterpart to this community. And in a way, I think that primed me for acts like Fairport Convention in particular, which, if I remember correctly, was given the nickname the British Jefferson Airplane, especially with their earlier stuff, which had a very American sound to it. So my understanding is that a lot of these acts were actually influenced by the folk rock movement that was happening in the States. So for me, I think I'm drawn to that element of it. I wasn't actually raised on traditional British folk. And so in a lot of ways, this was my entry point to British folk. Yeah.
Yeah, I that's a good point, and that's one of the things that drew me in. I came in via the Incredible String Band, who were one of the bands my parents had in common when they met in the late 70s, I guess, mid 70s, and they and then through things like Fairport Convention, and I guess the thing that I found really kind of compelling about that music is that it didn't sound like anything else. Most pop music derives, on a long enough stretch from the blues, and so you tend to get, all of the kind of musical artifacts that come from that. And it was really interesting to me that there were these people who were, in the case of the Incredible String Band, trying to do something completely new, and so it occasionally sounded like it had been written by space aliens.
Yes.
Space aliens
aliens who played at UFO, Joe Boyd's UFO.
But in the case of Fairport Convention, it was like, what if we tried to do rock music, but we used British folk as the base rather than the blues, but took the same kind of, I guess, evolutionary approach to that something like Cream takes to the blues. Like we're going to turn everything up louder and get into big long jams and things, but we're going to do it with this other bass. And that was a very interesting thing to hear.
Yes, actually, you asked before what my introduction to this music was, and I just realized that it was actually Incredible String Band, the first of these artists that I heard, and they, of course, played at Woodstock. But I learned today that they were meant to play on the first day with all of the other folk and acoustic artists, but refused because it was raining. So they were put on in the middle of the second day, I believe, when the weather was better, but when they were surrounded by all these hard rock acts. So they actually weren't very well received. And they weren't featured on the more famous documentary. But when I was 14, my local Civic Video, aging myself a little bit here, had this sort of bootleg Woodstock DVD that I used to check out about once a month. And the Incredible String Band performance was on that DVD.
Yeah.
And I loved it because they were completely unconventional. They were all dressed like hippies, and they got on stage and made just a raucous noise, really. And I think that's the appeal in a lot of ways of the Incredible String Band, that they very much have this like singing around the table over drinks at the pub tone to their music.
Yeah.
Whereas Fairport Convention tends to be a little bit more focused on the musicality. They tend to be a bit tighter with their harmonies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the string band is sort of like you sit down at the table at the pub, but then someone starts singing like quarter tones,
exactly.
And doing these like enormous soaring wails in your kind of pub sing-along. It's that weird kind of incongruity. My dad used to go and see them about once a year when he was a teenager, because he was just a teenager at the right place and time in Scotland. And he said that they would never do songs you knew. They would never do songs that you'd heard at previous concerts. So there was always completely new material. So it was often quite rough. And they would always do things like we're going to play a tune by picking people out of the audience and handing them each a bell that plays a different note. And then I'm going to just point at them one by one, and we'll get a little tune out of that. And all of this kind of, very hippy-dippy stuff.
Yeah, I'd heard that their act was very theatrical in nature, and it focused more on the act even than the music sometimes. So I'm sure that was an incredible experience. They were also so prolific. A lot of those acts put out many, many albums in a short space of time. So yeah, it was a very productive period for a lot of these artists.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, interestingly, I think the Incredible String Band are a good example of this, but you could probably find similar stuff about some of the other bands that we've mentioned, is that they didn't have enormous pop success. I think, I looked this up at one point, I think they got to number 40 on the singles chart. That was their commercial peak with the song Witch's Hat, which I think is off 5,000 Spirits, that album that you mentioned. But if you look at interviews that people like Led Zeppelin were giving, they were saying, there's this Scottish band, the Incredible String Band, they're really cool. And so it's kind of like the band you like were listening to.
Yes. Yeah, I think the same is true of Nick Drake. A lot of, especially modern indie artists, cite him as a major influence. His story in particular is very sad because he never achieved commercial success. And I don't think he was really well recognized until sort of the early 2000s even, because his one of his songs, I think, was featured on the Garden State soundtrack. And a whole lot of indie darlings fell in love with him. And so he achieved fame years and years after he died. And, of course, he died in a fairly tragic way, and he was painfully shy and his career was going nowhere. So I think he died at 26.
Yeah, something like that. I've read, have you read Joe Boyd's book?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so he's written a book. It's called White Bicycles, Making Music in the 1960s or something like that. It's definitely called White Bicycles. The subtitle's the bit that I'm not certain about. But reading that, I think, because he, as I kind of said at the start, he had a lot of people who have a kind of cult following but never truly kind of smashed the mainstream success. And I get the sense that reading his book that Nick Drake's the one that he kind of really feels like that he feels in some ways personally responsible that he got this kid and set him up and sent him out into the world, and then he just kind of ran headlong into it like a brick wall and bounced off. And largely because there was no, like, Nick Drake's problem was that all of his songs required a new, completely insane tuning on the guitar. And he only had one guitar, and he had no stage craft at all. So his first album, I recall, did reasonably well, and he went and toured folk clubs where you can get away with that kind of behavior. And then to try and make the second album go across, he was touring much bigger venues where you can't just sit on the stage for 5 minutes staring at your hands while you retune and then play another song without talking. And that was kind of what did him in. And Joe Boyd kind of talks in his book about feeling like he didn't really provide the support or know how to provide the support to make that work.
Yeah, I think I really relate to Nick Drake in that sense. It seems like he was very dedicated to his songcraft. And Nick Drake himself was quite a brilliant songwriter and musician. I'm not suggesting that I am a brilliant songwriter and musician in saying I relate to him, but he used to do a lot of his takes completely live, guitar and vocals. And I think I saw in an interview that Joe Boyd said that everything he did was perfect. So from a producer engineer perspective, he never really had to do anything other than set up the mics and know that Nick Drake would be doing his takes perfectly. It was all the other musicians that he was having to arrange. But I completely appreciate where Nick Drake was coming from, in that I didn't realize when I got into performing music with my band Tweed that writing songs and performing songs are two completely different skill sets. And just because you're good at one doesn't mean that you're going to be good at the other. And I think in a lot of cases, if you're good at the latter, the performance, you're much more likely to do well than if you're good at the former, the songwriting. So I have a lot of respect for Nick Drake because I'm someone who would be more likely to be sitting at home listening to an album than going out and watching other people perform their music. I'm a bit of an introvert, so sometimes I find that when I get up on stage, I'm completely gobsmacked because I don't know how to talk to a room full of people. It's a real skill. I'm all good one-on-one or in a small group, but it actually takes a lot of skill to figure out how to have a conversation with, 300 or 1,000 people who aren't going to be able to speak back to you and actually ideally are not speaking back to you.
No, it's an entirely different thing, and I mean that's why a lot of music industries around the world operate on a kind of performer songwriter, like those are separate people who do different jobs kind of
Exactly.
model. That's kind of why that works as an industrial unit, if you like.
Yeah, in a way, I think Nick Drake is sort of my ideal model of success in that, minus the premature death.
Yeah.
In that he sort of worked away at his music and released some albums and then later on became famous. I think that would be my ideal. I'd like to just sort of plug away at making music for most of my adult life. And if people want to make me famous when I'm 70 and nobody really cares anymore, then I'm perfectly happy with that.
Yeah, just as you say, avoiding dying at 26 is the key, really.
Well, I have succeeded in that endeavor as a 32-year-old.
Good work.
Thank you.
It's the odd stage you can get of like checking off dead rock stars on your calendar. I beat so and so.
Yes, that's right. I'm steadily working towards Lennon.
Yeah. The trick's going to be Keith Richards.
Yes, I think Keith Richards will still be alive when I reach his current age.
Yeah, I mean, we need to think about the sort of world we're leaving for Keith Richards. It's a big responsibility.
That's right.
So there's actually, it was interesting that you mentioned the kind of Laurel Canyon bands because a kind of bit of connective tissue there is the Grateful Dead, who weren't really part of that set but knew a lot of those people. And
that's right. They were more San Francisco based.
Yeah, and so like the point where you start hearing really nice harmonies on Grateful Dead albums, that's because they'd been hanging out with Crosby, Stills and Nash.
That's right. Like American Beauty around 1969 or 70.
Yeah, that's right. And shortly afterward, in the course of recording their album Workingman's Dead, Jerry Garcia became fascinated with pedal steel. And that's where the pedal steel on Crosby, Stills and Nash albums after that comes from.
Like on Teach Your Children.
Yeah, exactly. That's Jerry Garcia.
Yeah.
And so
amazing.
There's actually a connection back there because one of the Grateful Dead's kind of set closes that they do is an a cappella version of the song I Bid You Good Night, which is a sort of I think it's a Bahamian spiritual rather than a Black African spiritual.
Right.
Which the Incredible String Band incorporate into one of their big, long, kind of multi-part songs. Right. And I have a strong suspicion that they either both cribbed it from the same source or they cribbed it from each other, and I don't know exactly which direction that went. But they were both around at the same places and times.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a similar connection with Simon and Garfunkel because, of course, Paul Simon spent some time in London and brought back Martin Carthy's version of Scarborough Fair, or at least Martin Carthy alleges that it was stolen, and really started to incorporate some of that finger-picking style, which there was clearly quite a community for with Bert Jansch and John Renbourn. And if you listen to early John Martyn, he was very much in that virtuosic fingerpicking community. So yeah, I think Paul Simon really benefited as a musician and as a songwriter from his time in the UK.
Yeah, John Martyn's interesting because he starts with the sort of fingerpicking thing, and his two big innovations were starting to use an early echo unit to make the fingerpicking into this kind of strange textural thing.
Yeah.
And also starting to mess with his vocal style.
Slurring.
Yeah. You hear it on modern on Solid Air, and
absolutely.
He's said in interviews that what he was trying to do was mimic the way that a saxophone behaves in an arrangement, and that's why he started doing that as a kind of vocal style
affectation.
That was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because it coincides with the point in his career. I think you start to hear it a little bit on Bless the Weather, which I think is the album that came out before Solid Air. But that's sort of the point in his career where he starts moving in a very deliberate fashion towards jazz. He has a fascinating career because he starts out with that really traditional, almost cutesy and novelty finger-picked traditional songs, and then moves towards rock when he sort of got together with his wife and they were making albums together. They had that sort of upstate New York rock style, which I believe those albums were produced by Joe Boyd and John Wood, or those are the ones really that they worked on the most. And then he sort of dropped his wife and, according to her, ruined her career in the process and started doing solo work. And that's about where he starts to go towards jazz. And yeah, that's my favorite period. I sort of was raised on, 60s and 70s classic rock and folk, Latin American music, and jazz. And so at any point where any of those factors intersect, I tend to fall in love with it. And John Martyn, as you said earlier, he has a sound that is incomparable to anyone else. Yeah.
I think that's a good point to pick up the discussion. We're about at the halfway mark, so we need to go to a quick break, and we will continue the discussion right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back. Wonderful ads. Do whatever they told you to do. They probably told you to download an app, which, yeah. Anyway, you're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast made with the assistance of New Zealand On Air under the auspices of Manawatu People's Radio. And this evening I am talking to Nancy Howie about the kind of expanded Joe Boyd, John Wood-iverse, particularly kind of as it relates to 60s and 70s music. And really the only reservation here is that there must be something that caused all of these acts that were kind of incredibly influential to not also be kind of enormous musical smashes and instead kind of cult hits that you need to hunt out. You said a really interesting thing before the break. You were talking about John Martyn and about how he has a very kind of singular sound. And I guess that is a thing that sticks out to me about Joe Boyd's ear and kind of John Wood's studio approach as well, is that a lot of the people who are kind of considered core to that scene, if you like, do have a very singular sound. Like Danny Thompson, once you know what Danny Thompson's bass playing sounds like, you tend to be able to pick it out. Similarly with Richard Thompson's guitar playing, Nick Drake is just a singular arranger and composer. The incredible string bands sound like nothing else on earth. And I wonder if that's a kind of a key part of the approach that's so appealing, is that they found these people who really didn't sound like anyone or anything else, and then they adopted this production approach to kind of make them sound more like that rather than like anything else.
Yeah, that's an interesting take for sure. It's hard to say because, as you mentioned earlier, there was it's hard to separate the individual acts from their collaborations with each other. And I've been reflecting on what you were saying about what it was that made their music inaccessible. Not inaccessible, but prevented it from really blowing up and doing really well. And I think it's that there was something either slightly weird or slightly complex about it that alienated a sector of the public. Like, I've been listening to like Vashti Bunyan, whose music I think is this lovely, peaceful pastoral folk, but she's got a really unusual voice, and that would have alienated some people. Or, as you say, Incredible String Band had that flair for theatricality, and they behaved really oddly on the stage. So I think that there would have been something really strange. I noticed that actually both of them worked with Kate and Anna McGarrigle as well. I don't know if you saw that. They're sort of less of the British folk rock tradition.
I did see that.
But they've got that same sort of almost too quirky, not certainly not for me, but probably for a lot of people, approach to their songwriting and performance. And similarly with, Nick Drake, his music is really complex. His chord voicings are, they do translate really easily to jazz. He's been covered by the likes of Brad Mehldau and a lot of others because it lends itself to that language. He's already using those complex chords, and so is John Martyn. And between the jazz chords and his weird vocal inflections, I think a lot of people would be put off by John Martyn. So I think you're right that Joe Boyd must have had an ear for that unusualness that he was finding in these musicians. And it must have really attracted the musicians to each other as well.
Yeah, I think so. And because I had listened to the playlists that you very helpfully put together as a kind of research and reminder aid. And I do think you kind of hear that in the later work that both of them do as well. So Joe Boyd eventually goes on to work for Island, and the kind of representative track from that period that showed up in the playlist was one of the Toots and the Maytals ones. And
yes, that's right.
I love
Reggae
Toots.
Got Soul.
Yeah, I love Toots and the Maytals, but Toots is he had this kind of like everything turned up to 11 kind of gospel shouter vocal delivery, which is quite unusual in reggae, which it tends to lean on a kind of a crooning style a bit more. So again, it's the Joe Boyd pick is the strange high energy shouty man,
yes,
as opposed to the more conventional style or more conventional genre attribute havers.
Yeah, so like in that sense, I wasn't surprised to see some artists like Soft Machine and Pink Floyd on Joe Boyd's list because they're complicated. The one that really surprised me was Maria Muldaur, who of course did Midnight at the Oasis. But I mean, when I think about it, that song, I think it did relatively well. But it is a strange one to have done well because she has a weird voice and the chords are very jazzy, and it's a strange one in that same family of strange that we're finding with these other artists.
Yeah, I mean it's a Torch song where like the second line is "send your camel to bed." It's like there's some self-aware oddness going on with that particular.
Exactly. Yeah, but she's got sort of an almost wailing style of singing. And the guitar solo, I was actually listening to it the other day. It came up on one of my playlists. And I couldn't work out whether the guitarist was very skilled or completely unskilled. Like the timing of the solo is really unusual, but the note choices are really complex and quite jazzy. So I listened to it a couple of times, and at the end I still couldn't tell whether the guitarist was any good or terrible.
Yeah, that's actually another good point, I think, because one of the things that I notice about the kind of particularly the super prolific like 60s, 70s phase is that a lot of the records will have elements on them that are not conventionally good.
Yes.
Like
I think especially Incredible String Band.
Yeah, because
they're always singing out of time with each other, or the harmonies are slightly off, or
yeah, and you'll notice that like there's a standard thing as an audio engineer that you'll do if you're trying to make backing vocals gel, which is that you do kind of the opposite of what you would do to a lead vocal. So with a lead vocal, you want everything to be nice and crisp and defined and articulated most of the time so you can understand what they're saying. And you might deliberately do the opposite to a backing vocal. You might take some frequencies out to make them less distinct, to make everything kind of blur into a mass a bit more so that it kind of coheres and provides a pad for the lead vocalist to be in front of. And it sounded to me a lot of the time like John Wood wasn't doing that. Like he would leave backing.
Like everyone's the lead vocal.
yeah. And so you hear these things where people are doing very pretty harmonies, but you can hear quite clearly like the characteristics of each voice, which is kind of an unusual approach to take.
That's right. There's no blending really.
Or there is, but it's blending through, I don't know, shared atmosphere or something like that, rather than manipulating the sound to blur things.
Yeah. Actually, what's just occurred to me, this is kind of a weird comparison, but it reminds me a lot of Sly and the Family Stone, who, of course, also played at Woodstock, in that it was a group and there were harmonies, but also they really showcased the individual voices. Incredible String Band, in its own way, does a very similar thing, but in less of a funk influence, more of a folk influence. But very similar thing. The vocals don't always blend, and often the individuals will have their own parts that they sing and then bring together as a raucous group of singers.
Yeah, John Wood has been quoted on Incredible String Band sessions that they would go all night, and then you would come in the morning and try and work out what they had left you and how to kind of arrange all of these parts into a song. Because
it sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does. I get the sense that they were very much enthusiasts in the studio, and so they would go, "Oh, how about we add this, and how about we add this, and how about we add this," and so you end up with like layers and layers and layers of odd percussion choices and things. I guess when I was talking about things being not conventionally good, I was also thinking about like there's particularly with female vocal performers, there's less of an emphasis on having like the prettiest voice. And it's
absolutely
a lot more about having a striking voice or an interesting delivery. In the case of Vashti Bunyan, who's kind of a little girl whispering in your ear some of the time.
That's right. Or Maria Moldauer. Like her voice is definitely striking. I suppose it could be considered pretty, but she's got this very fast vibrato that's almost comical at times. I mean, the same could be said of Sandy Denny to an extent.
Yeah.
She's well loved for having a beautiful voice, but it's also a very distinctive voice. She doesn't really sound like anyone else, and she's got a similar, almost trilling vibrato. And her pitching isn't always perfect, which, I really enjoy.
Yeah, no, and you notice that actually a lot on the playlist, that there'll be a mix that's crafted to make the best of a performance which isn't like perfectly on pitch or perfectly in time, or there are harmony vocalists who are not quite perfectly in tune with each other. But the mix is kind of, or the way everything's done is kind of crafted to just kind of present that to you as the thing that it is, like, I don't know, getting veggies with dirt on them or something.
So I suppose the conclusion we're arriving at is that Joe Boyd and John Wood were good at their jobs.
Yeah. Good at their jobs and had particularly striking and singular taste, which, if you're into the same things as them, will stand the test of time.
That's right. On the subject of production, a little fact that I stumbled upon that I found interesting was that Joe Boyd really enjoyed working with Nick Drake because all of the others they were either in bands already or had very clear a very clear sense of the kinds of arrangements that they wanted, because everybody had their parts and everybody had written their parts, whereas he was a man with a guitar. So he was free to sort of go a bit wild with his arrangements and, bringing in Danny Thompson and adding strings and that sort of thing. And he said that he took it as a mark of what Nick Drake thought of his production on Brighter Later, that he insisted that Pink Moon was just him and a guitar again. So he must have thought that he'd gone a little overboard with it. Which, to be fair, I can agree with. Pink Moon is my favorite of his 3 albums because it's so stripped back. You get to really appreciate what he's doing as a songwriter and as a guitar player.
Yeah, I have my favorites with the Pink with the Nick Drake albums. The Pink Drake album, Nick Moon, with the Nick Drake albums are the first and the last.
Yes.
I find the middle one has some kind of overblown moments that eat Nick Drake a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing on the first one is like the string arrangements are, he got his friend from school who was just beginning to learn composition and went, hey, you do the string arrangements. And this guy went, and then kind of did the thing.
Exactly as you were saying about artists not necessarily being conventionally good, but making it work. It's a really good illustration of that, I think.
Yeah. And then as you say, Pink Moon is just Nick and his guitar and John Wood, who was basically the only human that he could handle talking to. And I have a hard time with it because it, on the one hand, it is just him and his guitar. And you can really hear what he's doing and he is just astounding. But also it's so bare that it can be a difficult listen because you can sort of hear everything creeping up on Nick through the shadows around the edges.
Same thing. Yeah, you can hear the direction that he's isolating himself. Basically, it's an oral illustration of his isolation because he did end up sort of becoming a hermit before he died. I think he lived in his parents' basement and just stopped seeing people or talking to people. He just disappeared. So, yeah, as you can say, there's definitely a haunting aspect to Pink Moon because musically it foreshadows what's about to happen. So I can definitely appreciate that. I think what I like most about Pink Moon is that with the way that the guitar is on display, you can hear the tunings, his weird tunings really clearly. And he sounds almost like a male counterpart to Joni Mitchell.
Yeah, and it's interesting that because Joni Mitchell famously made a lot of those musical choices as a way to make the guitar more playable and more approachable for her as a post-polio survivor.
Yeah.
But Nick Drake did it for sort of arrangement purposes. There were chords that he wanted to play that you couldn't easily play in standard tuning. There's another, I can't remember, alas, the name of the person whose YouTube video it was, so I can't point people to it in any quick and easy way. But there is a YouTube video where there's a guitarist who's kind of meticulously gone and tried to reconstruct the Pink Moon sound and vibe. And the really interesting observation that he mentioned in the course of that video was that a key part of the Nick Drake sound is actually really old strings.
Yeah, they are actually quite dull, aren't they?
Yeah, he's got this really kind of subdued guitar tone, despite the fact that he was fingerpicking, I think, with long nails, which
it is almost percussive, like it sort of slaps.
Yeah, and yet the actual guitar sound is very mellow. And
right.
The guy's solution was, I think, what we're hearing is incredibly old strings, which is just another of these kind of, it's people getting a suboptimal thing and then making the very best possible use out of it. Nick Drake never wanted to change his strings, and this is a key part of the thing.
That's so funny. That had never occurred to me, but actually, yes, that's what my guitar sounded like at the end of 2020 when I hadn't been playing live with my band and I had no reason to change my guitar strings because, nothing had broken, but they'd been played a bunch and they We weren't recording, and there was no reason for, aside from me recording an album, which I hadn't realized I was doing at the time, there was no reason to go out and buy new strings. And for several months of the year, I couldn't go out and buy strings anyway. So yeah, by the end of 2020, actually, you can probably hear it on the last track of the album, because that was the last one I recorded. And yeah, I'm really striking the strings hard, because they don't have that, they don't have the sustain that new strings do. So they're getting absolutely beaten to pieces on that track, which I was going to say is possibly why Nick Drake sort of twangs the strings so hard. He's not getting the sustain out of them. Which lends it that percussive element. You can hear it especially on Which Will.
Yeah. I had another thought and it went out of my head, but in lieu of that thought,
sorry,
no, that's quite all right. The other surprise discovery I think it was on the John Wood playlist for me, was Cat Stevens from the album The Buddha and the Chocolate Box.
Yes,
which is an album I bought on tape for 50 cents because all of my hippy dippy friends were listening to Cat Stevens. Of course, they were listening to Tea for the Tillerman, but the one that was in the secondhand record shop for 50 cents on cassette was Buddha and the Chocolate Box, so I bought that.
That's great. I love that album.
It's really cool. Yeah.
It's got some fantastic songs on it. My introduction to Cat Stevens was actually via cassette tape as well. My dad was working as a sailmaker in Mexico, and he had taken over from somebody else who had gone on holiday for a bit, if I remember correctly. And so he'd left his VW van to my dad so he could transport these huge sails around. And he had left the cassette tape of Tea for the Tillerman in the tape deck in that old VW van. And I loved the album. I really took to it and listened to it constantly. I don't actually know if I gave it back now that I think about it. I was 9 at the time. I think I might have made off with it. But yeah, stunning songwriting. But you can see how Cat Stevens is more commercially viable. I think he's a very sort of tidy songwriter who's easy to listen to. His chords aren't too complex. His voice is quite pleasant.
Yeah, and mostly what you're hearing in terms of the John Wood's influence on that record, it felt to me was you're hearing things that have been recorded well in a nice sounding room, which seems to be the kind of the key to the John Wood thing is get a nice room, put a decent mic in it in the right spot, and then get the people to play the thing, and don't mess with it too much afterwards.
I think that's a good philosophy.
Yeah. If you can do it, absolutely.
If you can get it right at the outset, do it that way.
And I guess you maybe hear a bit less of the like super processed big explodey drums that you hear on some earlier Cat Stevens things on that one.
That's right. Yeah, I think the big explodey drums come back in at the end as well, towards the end of his career. What's the Foreigner Suite? That's got some fairly heavy parts to it, and that's a bit later. But yeah, his quiet guitar stuff is really lovely. So yeah, you can definitely hear the influence of John Wood on Buddha and the Chocolate Box.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for coming on the show. We are coming up on time. So there are two things I like to do by way of rounding up the conversation. The first is if people have listened to this and they want to find their own way, and are there recommendations you would give them as like good starting points?
I would say if it is a rainy night in the middle of winter and you've got a fireplace, you should listen to Solid Air. Absolutely. It's one of my all-time favorite albums.
Yep. And I think that's a good call. I would pitch for the first Nick Drake album as well, because it's a really good balance of Nick's kind of singular vision and all of the elements coming together to to make a record that's quite approachable as well, particularly for modern people who are like post indie folk sensitive singer-songwriter. I don't know when the boom in that was, but I feel like there was one. And after like lots of people singing about their feelings with finger-picked acoustic guitars, Nick Drake becomes a bit more approachable.
That's right.
As a benefit of having influenced all these other people.
Exactly, yeah. If you like Elliott Smith, then you already like Nick Drake. You just don't know it yet.
I guess the other pitch I would give is check out Joe Boyd's book. It's called White Bicycles, as I say. And there's another book which is called, there's two other books. There's one called Electric Eden, which is a look at the
that's a great book.
The British folk rock scene in general. And so Joe Boyd kind of is, and John Wood have kind of threaded through a lot of that, but they also talk about people who weren't affiliated with them, like Steel Eye Span and I think Heron were outside of that. Heron,
yes, that's right.
The band on the cover of the book, recording in a field.
I can't believe it's taken this long for that book to come up. Because after I discovered John Martyn, I just went on this just rampage. I needed more music that sounded like John Martyn, so I ended up reading that book as part of a desperate search to find more John Martyn once I'd sort of covered his main albums. Very, very good book, really comprehensive and surprisingly short.
Yes, yeah. I should really have brought it up earlier. That is on me, kind of. There's a final book. It's called You Know What You Could Be, and it's about half of it is an autobiography of the early bit of the Incredible String Band by Mike Heron, and the other half is by this guy called Andrew Gregg, who's a Scottish novelist and artist who was a big Incredible String Band and formed a duo called Fate and Ferret, inspired by the Incredible String Band as a teenager. And they never did anything of note, but they did go and bother Joe Boyd at Witch Season, and he was very nice to them and bought them dinner. And it's a really interesting account of them kind of crashing into this scene and witnessing what was going on there, and of Joe Boyd as kind of this, I guess, supportive figure kind of at the nucleus of all of these people flailing around doing their individual things.
That's really cool. May I add to that one thing I wouldn't recommend? I wouldn't recommend a book called Some People Are Crazy, which is a title or the first line of a John Martyn song. It is a biography. And if you want to like John Martyn, I can't recommend reading anything about him because he was kind of a jerk. Yeah. Really brilliant musically, but kind of a terrible person.
Yeah, there's a story Danny Thompson tells about them being on tour and him just getting so fed up of John Martyn's shit that he waited till he passed out drunk, which was a nightly occurrence, and then lifted the carpet and put it down over the top of him so that when he woke up, he would be trapped, tacked down under the carpet and have to escape. Not a nice man.
Not a nice man.
The last thing I like to do is to give you a chance to plug your various things. We mentioned Tweed and Fathom both. So where can people find those? Where can people find you on the internet, so on and so forth?
That's very charitable of you. Thank you, Hugh. The Tweed and Fathom are both on all streaming platforms. The Tweed album I would recommend is Highbrow Blues. And the Fathom album, which I've just put out, is called The World to Breathe. And on it are about 25 DIY experimental instruments that I made in my basement during the lockdowns of the last couple of years. So, and I'm on Instagram at Fathom Music NZ and YouTube. I make my own videos as well. So on YouTube is Fathom NZ.
Excellent. And I have to, in doing research for the last interview we did, I discovered a thing, which is that if you want to find you need to make sure that you put Fathom Music NZ, because if you just go Fathom NZ, Radio New Zealand did a documentary series about sex work, which is called Fathom. And you will find that instead because it's on RNZ and they have a lot of internet weight. So Fathom Music NZ is what you want.
Thank you. Alternatively, if you search for Fathom and my name, Nancy Howie, that usually comes up.
Excellent. Thank you very much for talking, Nancy.
Thank you so much for facilitating this discussion, Hugh. I've really enjoyed it.
Excellent. You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.